Welcome back. In this video we are going to prepare the different models that we're going to need, because we are going to need quite some of them. We're going to need a lot of different classes which will take care of everything that we can see here, which is basically just this code here brought into a format that is easier readable, let's say. So into this format you can see it's this code here, and then we're going to prepare the code to make an API call to our home open weather map org, so we can then get this kind of result, and then finally of course we will use that in order to display it accordingly later on. Okay, so in order to get that, let's first of all create the different models. I'm going to prepare 2 of them with you, and the other ones you will have to build yourself. So I'm just going to quickly show you the first ones that are the major ones, so to speak. So we will need a model for the whole response. So the whole weather response, which will be this JSON object. And you can see we have multiple different variables in there. So we have, for example, the coord, the weather, the main, the wind, the clouds, the sys. Then we have the DT, the ID, the name, and the cod. Okay, so let's add those into our project. All right. Let's go back to the project and then create a new folder, I'd say, in order to keep everything clean. So in here, I'm going to create a new directory, new package. This one will be called models, and actually models like this. All right, in here, I'm going to create a new Kotlin file, which will be a Kotlin class, and I'm going to call this one weather response. So this one will be a data class, weather response. And now in this data class, I want to have all of the different variables that we had there. So first of all, we had the coord, which will be of type coord. Then we had the weather, which will be a list of objects. So here we just have one weather object, which is the ID, main clear, description clear sky, and an icon. All right, so this is the actual weather object, but we have a list of weather objects. Okay, then we have base, which is just a string. We have main, which is another class which has a bunch of doubles in there. Humidity could be an int, but that's something that we can look at. Then we have a wind class, so to speak, which has 2 variables, one of them being a double, the other one being an integer, and so forth. Okay, so I'm just going to finish this one up real quick. So we have a list of weather. Of course, we don't have a weather class yet. We will need to prepare that. We have the base, which is a string. We have the main, which is a main class. The visibility, which is going to be an integer. The wind, which will be a wind object. So here, wind, which will be a wind object. Clouds, which will be a clouds object. DT, which will be an integer. Sys, which will be a sys object. ID, which is an integer. And then the name, which is a string. And then finally we have the COD, which is going to be an int. Okay, so how do I get all of those things? Where do I get them from? Well, let's look at it from this perspective. So we have coord, which is, if we open up, an object. Then we have a list here, which is a list of weathers. So we have a list of weather. Then we look at base. You can see base is just a string because we have those quotation marks here. We have another object or a class which will be called main. So we have main here, which has a bunch of values in it. Then we have the clouds class. Well, we have the wind here as well. Visibility, where does that come from? Well, it's not available in this case. But as you can see here, in other cases, they also have this visibility here. So we could make it null potentially, or set it to 0 or something like that. But you can see some API calls have it, some don't display it, but we will potentially get that later on. So let's put that in there as well. So you can see that we will need to set those things up. Okay, so I'm going to show you one of them, which will just be the court. Okay, so we have the weather response, and by the way, I want this to be serializable so that we can then later on use it in different formats and store it, for example, because I want to be able to store a weather response on the phone as a string, so we need to make it serializable. So then let's go ahead and create another model class. So here, new Kotlin class, and as I said, I'm gonna call this one coord. So coordinates, C-O-O-R-D, and this one will be another data class. And what do we have in coord? Val long, which will be a double, and then val let, which will also be a double. Okay, so this is our class coord, and I will also make this serializable. All right, because we use it in our weather response. So now you can see coord, this arrow disappeared. So now what you will need to do is you need to do that with weather, main, wind, clouds, and sys. So you need to look at weather. So how does a weather object look like? And it's, as you can see here, it has an ID, which is an integer. It has a string called main, a string called clear description, and a string called icon. Then you need to do the same thing with main. You create a main class, which has a double, which is called temp, another double, which is called pressure, and so forth. So please pause the video and build those up. So this is really going to be good practice, because you will need to have those models in order for them to work perfectly fine with JSON, because we're going to use JSON again. And you have seen in the demo how JSON works, right? And it needs to have the clean structure for your classes in order to work correctly. All right, so I hope you added all of those different classes to your models. Now let's look at those step by step, and I'm going to make this a little bigger here. So we have the clouds here. If we look at the clouds, let's open those up here. Let's open everything. So let's look at clouds. We can see clouds has something called all, which is of type int. Now let's look at main. You can see we have the temperature here, which is a double. Then we have the pressure, which is also a double. Humidity is an integer, as it seems. Temp min is a double. Temp max is a double. And then we have sea level and ground level. Well, you can implement them, but for me it worked without those. So in most calls I won't get this information, but if you want to really make sure, then you would also have the sea level here, which is going to be a double. And then finally the ground level, which will also be a double. All right. Okay, so this is our main class. Then we have sys. If we look at sys, you can see we have message, which is a double. We have the country, which is a string. We have the sunrise, and we have the sunset. And as you can see in this case, we don't have the type. So this is something that you might want to add as well. That's why we look over them, because this response here is potentially not having all of the data that we're going to get later on. Okay, so we will need to see what the response will be like once we use our own API call. Okay, because this is just from the sample data, but once we use our own API call, we might get more or less data. All right, then we can look at weather. So here a weather object is with an integer, which is the ID, then the main, which is a string, description, which is a string, and then icon, which is a string as well. We have the wind, which is the speed, and the degree, which speed will be double and degree will be integer. So here you see I use a double because here potentially we want to have the speed more precisely, but this really depends. So this could have been an integer as well. All right, so these are the different objects that we're going to need. And then if we look at weather response, you can see now the errors disappeared and all of them are good. Now, if you didn't have all of them exactly as I did, that's totally fine. You don't need to have all the values exactly as they are in my case, but they should fit to a certain degree with what you see here in your JSON viewer stack. So here in the response that you get from OpenWeatherMap. And you will have to double check once you get the real results, because these, as I said, are just samples. So once we double check that with our real API calls, then we can see that we, for example, will also need visibility or other variables that we don't see in this particular example, but maybe in the other code examples. So here in sys, as you can see, there is this type thing which wasn't available in our other example here. So if we look at sys, you can see there's no type here. So this really depends on what we get later on once we do the call. All right, I think this is going to be enough for this video, even though I wanted to add the other stuff as well, such as adding the call and everything else. But I just think this is a great point to make a break. And then in the next video, we're gonna add the interfaces and all of the other interesting stuff that we will need in order to make an API call. So see you there.